Hi, National Chief. Pleasure to welcome you to our set. Thank you so much for coming in.
Thanks for having us.
Is it the bill itself or the rush timeline that you're taking issue with?
The rush timeline. I think that, First Nations are very disappointed, First Nations rights holders, that they're being shut out of the process. We've seen that in committee this week, in the Senate, and of course in the committee in the House. And look, I think many of them were there. Many sat with me yesterday while I did my presentation in the Transport Committee in the House. But there were so many voices there that wanted to have their rights holders that were there that wanted to speak, and we didn't give them that respect, and I think this country could do better.
Do you mean when you say shut out of the process that only certain people were allowed to testify as this sort of legislative process unfolds in a very quick manner, and not everybody who wanted to say something was able to? Is that what you mean?
Well, we had submitted a list last week. There was lots of people that wanted to speak, that had an opinion. Unfortunately, there's some as well, I think 34 First Nations that probably even hadn't had a chance to look at the bill because they're busy fighting fighting fires across the country. And I feel for them as well. They haven't even had a chance to look through their emails because they're so busy. And the ones that are, 7 days is not enough time to look at a big bill like this that impacts rights. And look, First Nations aren't about stalling anything. And I think, in fact, they want prosperity, but not at the expense of their inherent rights.
So can I ask you to be specific about what rights you feel, based on your interpretation of the bill, will be contravened as it stands? And I'll put to you that the government contends that that won't be the case. That's at least what they're saying right now as they make their way through the legislative process.
Well, it would be nice if they made space to speak with First Nations, or made space for First Nations to come and speak, and Canadians, for instance. I think rushing a bill in 7 days is not the Canadian way. We shouldn't act like Trump and the way that they do things down there. I think that we're better than that as a country, and we should respect each other and make space for First Nations to come and talk about their rights, to come and talk about how this may or may not infringe, and to ask questions so that they can get more clarity. There's a lot of unknowns, and even just talking about major projects, for instance, what are they, where are they, and I know First Nations want to ask those questions, and they haven't had the chance.
The justification for that expedited timeline, as you point out, that the government has put forth is largely around the crisis, right, that exists because of the economic threats that Donald Trump has made and the tariffs that he has leveraged. Essentially, the argument is that it has sort of illuminated Canadians to the view that we aren't doing as much as we could be doing to advance our own prosperity, and that that prosperity has been, if anything, on a decline because of an inability to get stuff built. That's how I interpret what the government's argument has been thus far. Does it make sense? Do they have a point that we are in a crisis, and if not now, when?
Well, I think First Nations have been in a crisis for a long time. We don't have access to schools right now. When we want a loan to build, say we wanted to build a hospital, for instance, we would have to go to the government and ask for a ministerial loan guarantee. And I think that we have a real opportunity here in Canada to have this conversation between First Nations and with the government of Canada and the provinces, bringing everybody together to talk about some of these these issues that plague our country. And I think that if you show, if you read the Conference Board of Canada, we just done a study with them last month. Again, we released another section of it, but it shows that if you close the infrastructure gap for First Nations, it would propel this country from being one of the bottom of the G7 countries to the top. And I think that if we close the infrastructure gap for First Nations people, that's a good thing. Close the internet access, for instance. You and I have kids. We rely heavily on that for our kids to have access to basic high-speed internet. Many kids across this country don't have that. Schools, another one. Infrastructure just crumbling. Half of our communities need new schools. And I know that this country always wants to talk about prosperity and all that. They've done well all these years, but they've never brought along First Nations and helped us into that prosperity. And without the basics of life in our communities, we just want what other Canadian children have for our children: good, good jobs, good internet, good homes, safe communities, all these basic things. And we keep saying that to this country. And, and then they kind of promise us later, okay, well, give us some of your resources, give us more of your resources, because all of the GDP of this country comes from First Nations territory. Canada is on First Nations land, and we had shared that willingly with Canadians to make this beautiful country. We are foundational partners as First Nations, and we'll always stick up for our country. But at the same time, our country has to stick up for us and give us, help us close the infrastructure gap once and for all of our kids across this country.
Is there a way to do both of those things at the same time? Is there a way for the government to more adequately, and I don't think it's fair to say that they didn't address it at all, because there have been some advances, but I do take your point that it's certainly not at a level that would be commensurate with the rhetoric that's being employed, right? Is there a way for them to do more on that front and also do the stuff they want to do with this bill?
I think with this bill, bring the rights holders to the table, let's have a discussion. And I think you go farther along by having those discussions. It would be like trying to pass this bill and not talking to the premiers, for instance. But they all went and spoke together, and then they didn't even have a space for First Nations at that table yet again. So they're starting off on the wrong foot, and by excluding First Nations, they're doing themselves a disservice later, when you could iron out some of those issues that exist between the relationship. We've come a long way in our relationship. We have a long way to go, but I think ramming bills like this through push us back years.
I'm going to leave it on that note. National Chief, thank you so much for coming in. I appreciate it.
Thank you.